myself quite rejuvenated to get ready for the rigor of learning the first concept. So my first part of the presentation looks at idea of doctrinal research. Doctrinal qualitative research was the focus. For qualitative research, I'm only looking at three dimensions. One is the case analysis, which you are going to learn in the afternoon in detail, but I'll just give a glimpse of that. Second is case studies. I don't know how many of you have heard of case studies as a method. And the third one is content analysis. Atlas TI is going to use technology to hasten that, to deal with large mass of content materials out of which you can create content analysis based research findings. And then we are also looking at how to consolidate the research. Second part I am going to deal after 12 o'clock. Now we have started at 11:05. So by 12:05 we will start quality indicators. How do we look at quality in research? And then law reform research as a variety of research. Whether law reform research is a research by itself or every research should have a law reform component to make your research impacting is the question that we have to be very thorough with. And how to do it, why to do it, where to do it is what we are going to discuss in the post 12:05 session. So are you all set to receive the first concept? Yeah. So the first one is about doctrinal research. So is legal analysis, I mean whenever we talk about legal research methodology, can we have a methodology in terms of legal research? Is legal research or legal analysis necessarily based on a methodology, or is it a convention of norm or value or process that we imbibe as lawyers, as people working with the law? Is it intuitively absorbed by us? This is what Shinovich in one of his articles in 2008 said. I have enclosed that article, very interesting article. He draws the analysis of doctrinal research. What is doctrinal legal research method? While talking of that, he shows how jurisprudentially we all have the theories of law. You know, theory by Kelsen, theory by Hart, the realists, the American realists, the Scandinavian realists, the British realists, positivists, the naturalists. So there are many theories and approaches to law. Each theory has its emphatic point in terms of ought to guide the law, or what law ought to comply with, and how law is in actual operation. So what Shinovich finds very perplexing is the entire world of legal research in comparison to hard research which we have. What is the hard research that we have? He identifies natural sciences research, engineering research. In both natural sciences research, engineering research, which is to do with architecture, infrastructure, etc. There's a lot of empirical world, the world which you recognize by your sense experience, the facts which you experience by sense experience, measured and utilized. You would agree with that. Our whole experimental research domain in biological research, which is one part of the natural research. In natural research we have two parts. What are the natural sciences? What are they? Physical sciences and biological sciences. So in both these areas, as much as we get to apply these scientific theories, we get into the technology research, which is engineering and other areas. So these, according to him, are the hard researchers, whereas soft researchers, which are distributed in the field of management, for example, law, social sciences, education, psychology or behavioral studies. So all these come in the other right side quadrangle for him. So law is very similar to these kinds of approaches in the soft research areas. Whereas our attempt is to see that all soft research areas are conforming to the empirical validation and objectivity of the hard science research. That's what we try to do. So whenever we are doing empirical legal research, we are trying to conform to the yardsticks, or non-doctrinal research, we are trying to conform to the yardsticks of science as dictated by other soft researches such as management research, communication research, sociology research, psychology research. Do you get that? So this is the distinction that he is making. while making this distinction, he also draws a very nice model. This model is not his own model. He has picked this model from a scientist from Europe. So this is how Chernowith's analysis looks at legal doctrinal research with that skepticism. Is it episteme, means epistemology, the knowledge which is involved in doctrinal legal research, and the reality of law which is actually dynamically happening? Should we be more engaged with the episteme or the knowledge dimension, or should our knowledge dimension theories and propositions and approaches be vulnerable or changeable according to the limited realities which emerge in the court or in people's lives or in approaches? So this is a classic question that all of us engage with as legal researchers. When Dr. Bajpai was talking about the idea of research that is more and more empirical, there is a great what you call credential or commendation that such great scientists or legal scientists deserve. But on the other hand, there is a dose of skepticism by hardcore legal theorists who say that should these little realities be determining the landscape of legal doctrines or legal theories, because we cannot sacrifice a principle like human right just because certain realities are deviating from that. We need not have to change those basic values. That's why the sentence is a very meaningful sentence. Is legal analysis dictated by methodology or a convention of norm or value or process intuitively absorbed in legal practice or in engaging with law? What do you say? I'm sure, being true to the grain or salt of your orientation as lawyers, orientation as legal philosophers, you would go with the second part of the sentence, that it should be, whatever is the methodology, it should be intuitively guided by a convention of norm or value or process that law deserves as a means to justice. So never forget rights, never forget justice. Then you can engage in any methodology. You can't explain the phenomenon as it is and leave. You have a duty to bring it as close as possible to the ideal state of justice. So after sending that little caution, let me engage with the idea of doctrinal research. Now, basically the inquiry begs the question, what is research per se? Whether it is science, as I told you, natural science, or social science or behavioral science, or hard science like technology, research is the careful and close searching into a matter. I mean, here, what is the matter? Is that matter with 4 dimensions, length, breadth, width, volume? No, or height also we say. Is it that? Here the matter could be an abstract matter like the rights, So matter, where we go round and round, we do a thorough search from all angles, a comprehensive search. Then, secondly, research is also characterized by what we call as systematic investigation of the existing knowledge or facts for finding some truth or to discern a reality. How is this phenomenon or matter in reality? Whereas, if we apply that, our reality is legal reality. And that legal reality has people, it has systems, it has rules. What political scientists or social scientists call as norms. Norms are nothing but rules for us, but norms are more than rules for social scientists and behavioral scientists. Because norms may not be translating into rules in all cases. Norms are the behavioral modifications which are required or which are absorbed in order to have a peaceful organization or a society. So normative process, if you see in family law, for example, everything that structures a family is not necessarily in the legal norms. There are many other norms. So following that normative course of action, behavior which is conforming to certain set accepted patterns, that normative pattern. So there the word norm is about framework to the behavior. That norm is about regulating that behavior. That regulation may come by auto-suggestion, self-directed. It may come by circumstances It may come by an intelligent choice of being happy by following the norm. So normative or norm as such, anything to do with the norm is the engagement of law. That means it is not necessarily about legislations and case laws alone. It will go beyond that. Like yesterday in my undergraduate class, I was discussing Peter D'Souza's article on Uniform Civil Code. He is talking about how two stages of norm development in relation to Uniform Civil Code. First of all, focused on protecting at the independence period those minorities who might have been forced to migrate away from India or to India. So at that time we wanted to protect their interests. Therefore our law kept that differences as such without interfering in that. Second stage, he says that in the developmental process of the nation, we did not want to be hindered by these differences, so we did not disturb the status quo. Third stage, he says, was motivated by the polity rather than the constitutional governance. That is where he hits the core. So he says that moving further on, it has to be dictated by constitutional governance and the model code which is there in Goa. The Uniform Civil Code, which is quite successful, Common Civil Code it's called, Common Civil Code in Goa. So Peter's argument does not, I mean as a political scientist, does not restrict to the, he does posit it or state it or contextualize it in part 4 of the Constitution, Article 44. That's all the norm that he touches in terms of our sense of rules. Rest of the things he talks about the normative choices, normative approaches that our polity has taken. So there, political scientists' engagement with law need not necessarily limit to rules as we lawyers do. Do you see the difference? Suppose a lawyer were to write that. How would the lawyer write? Lawyer wouldn't engage in polity's choice of the norm, but rather than norm's rationality in polity. Why this norm came at that time, what Constituent Assembly debates happened, how did that Hindu Code Bill debate indicate the initial idea of having a code, I mean reluctance to get into codification itself. We did not want to capture the myriad practices of Hindu religion within the so-called code because we were scared that it may have a dominant version of Hinduism coming in there. Now, isn't that the real constitutional democracy? Is making law itself sometimes informed by a more powerful milieu within the critical mass who are going to be governed by that law. So that is the engagement of a law scientist or jurist. Whereas here it is more of a social scientist who is visiting the law from the point of view of how the polity of India is changing and impacting on the norm, not the other way around, or maybe the other way around, but more focused on the knowledge and the expertise in the field of the polity. Do you get that? So this is how you distinguish a legal research from the non-legal research. So in legal research, we are doing the systematic investigation of rules, principles, the legal principles, some of the legal principles, which may not be rules as such, but they may be principles. Like for example, principle of agreement should be observed in good faith. You know, all the agreements should be observed in good faith. Then principle of privity of contract. So non-parties to the contract or relationship which look like contract but there is no privity of contract in the legal sense. That is a study in equity, and that is a study historically how equity has lubricated the machinery of administration of justice and it kick-started the evolution of law. For example, evidence law principles of missing husband case, you know, evolving into evidence law principle, presumption of death, for example, how it evolved. So these kinds of things are ideas of legal principles or notions. Then concepts or theories or doctrines, the particular view about them or a combination of these. Like for example, I had a master student, today Dr. Vajpayee's article came, so I am connecting to that. She did a study on right to happiness. So when she came to me, she wrote an abstract in which she wrote that If Bhutan has it, if Madhya Pradesh government has superficial Anand Vibhag, I want to write about that. She is from Madhya Pradesh. See how a researcher is driven by the pain area or by the curiosity, by the connection that she feels. So I asked, why happiness of all the things? She said that I want to explore if it can become a constitutional right, whether right to happiness can be connected to Article 21. Then I asked her, do you know that in American Constitution, right to pursuit of happiness is one of the fundamental rights? She said, no. So initially you bring a problem, you haven't done your homework to look at it as a legal research. You are driven by a passion, you are driven by a notion, by an idea. So when she read that, I asked her, have you seen Sustainable Development Goals? How Sustainable Development Goals are a step ahead of Millennial Development Goals, where it not only looks at poverty elimination, but also looks at distributive aspect of wealth. So all this giving pledge and all which Bill and Melinda Gates have given into. A lot of people are publishing false stories about some rich people who are doing the giving pledge to force them. I mean, this is a kind of ploy that media is also doing to force them to give up wealth. I think Indians are very strong. But other countries, people are giving wealth, like Zach Welch and others are doing this giving pledge. So giving pledge as part of sustainable development. So is wealth also against happiness? Or by giving, you are becoming more happy? So some of these notions, I told her, have you looked into that? Then she started seeing Anand Vibhag in deeper analysis, Bhutan's right in deeper analysis, right to pursuit of happiness and its implementation in deeper analysis. And then she developed a model whereby constitutional scheme of right to happiness, possible, drawing from all these comparative contexts. Even in Scandinavian countries, this idea is very strong. And Sustainable Development Goals idea of happiness, how the two could correlate. So she developed a model whereby she said, if you want to bridge this gap, and if you want to bring it closer to the global obligation, international obligation of Sustainable Development Goals, what are the kinds of approaches that are required? So with those guidelines, she concluded her thesis. After all, it's a master's thesis. So you can't go beyond certain limit. Therefore, a particular view or explanation can also become the basis of a research. Now, if I take the last point, combination of some or all of them. So she had a rule, she had a principle, she had a theory and a concept, she had certain cases, she had done a comparative analysis, and then she had arrived at her conclusion where her research gave a framework of model. She developed a model. Now, sometimes what happens, there can be many other purposes in a legal research. Legal research can have a purpose to see if the rules governing a situation, their usefulness, their efficacy, like we have rules relating to children. Now there is High Court has issued a guideline that all children's homes have to be viewed. You have to view them from the point of view of guidelines which are given. Some of the researchers have done a study on rehabilitation dimension alone. Some have done on the management of the home and child's well-being, because after all it's a child, it's a minor. It is supposed to be these rehabilitation, and there is no idea of punishment of a child. So they are looking at in terms of reforming that child and making that child to receive all three: entertainment, education, and some kind of skills, and also some kind of happiness. So how children's homes are the sites of such fulfillment of purpose, not as a punishment but rather as a transformation. So we did a preliminary visit to a children's home, and we saw two types of homes. One is the child care centers. I mean, we don't call them child care, they care and rehabilitation centers. The other one we saw was where they were destitutes and they were brought into institutions. So in both we were disappointed because they had no clue about children's rights as enunciated under United Nations Convention or India's Children's Act and now under the JJ Act. So we saw that there was inadequacy of the law, there was lack of efficacy, there was no utility to the real object of the legislation. There was no relevance in the way that was implemented. So in these cases, what Roscoe calls law in text and law in context, that's the kind of study that most of the time people do in order to look at the efficacy or in order to look at the utility. Then we have studies, researchers coming from many law schools on the law established by the courts and how they have actually impacted. Sometimes some case laws have impacted constitutional amendments. They have impacted subsequent precedents. They have impacted some implementation at all levels in India. For example, you all know about Vishaka case. Vishaka case impacted in selected parts of India immediately the way the organizations were run. Within 1 week of the judgment, Symbiosis had internal complaints committee established as per the judgment. I was doing a study 2 years after the judgment came, 3 years after the judgment came. Nothing was done down south in any of the universities except they established a women's cell, which was more like all women will be there, and it was more on paper than actuality for NAC reports. And abuse cases, if they were reported, abuse by teachers, abuse by colleagues, they were always brushed under the carpet. There was no serious implementation. 2012, Supreme Court received a case, Medha Lele case, where Medha Lele spoke about, it was a public interest litigation, poor implementation of Vishaka guidelines. As a result, what you see is the legislation in 2013, the POSHA, or Prevention of Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act, protection from and prevention of. So this legislation was necessitated after about 15 years after the judgment. Look at the gap it takes. So these are the kinds of research topics which students can engage in. Like for example now, SC/STs, atrocities prevention legislation. Look at that legislation and then don't go through the cases alone. Go through the cases of service matters and then you see how many of the litigants come from SC/ST community. Very interesting dynamics emerge. This law seems to be disused and misused in many cases. Of course, in some cases it has done its good. So, recent Supreme Court backlash on this whole legislation and the rights claimed under this legislation, it should be viewed in a larger context. So that is where we find a new idea of applicable dynamic character of law. So law is not to be viewed in little silos. It has to be viewed in the holistic context as a dynamic force. Similarly, we have environmental law. We have international law norms. For example, only recently in right to privacy, or who said progressive realization of rights. Anybody has read the latest judgment on eligibility? Yeah. There is a reference to the sentence progressive realization of rights. Why? Where is that coming from? Where is the phrase progressive realization of rights coming from? Just go to the United Nations Covenant on social, economic and cultural rights. There in the preamble it is said that as far as developing nations are concerned, they could be materializing progressive realization of rights. So, Supreme Court's language is changing. Earlier they bothered more about Part 4 having these rights but non-justiciable. So most of the engagement was to expand the most supreme right of Article 21 and expanding it by feeding from Part 4. Today, of course, in number of cases, they have built their rationale on United Nations Human Rights Discourse, whether it is Neelabati Behra. Even in this case, Neelabati Behra is cited. And Vishaka guideline, Vishaka judgment also, the economic, social and cultural rights have been cited, CEDAW has been cited. Today, it's much more than that. It is citing the very preamble of that convention, the objective of the convention. Very interesting, isn't it? So this is how the law is evolving. Now, how far our researchers are looking at it from the point of view of international law? We have one book on India and international law edited by Professor Bimal Patel. But again, the articles therein are very, I would use the word black letter. Black letter means decisions and legislations have been analyzed and one side-by-side kind of treatment between international law and that. More critical evaluation of implementation of international law is required, so much more scope for research exists. I'm just giving you that example. For example, whole lot of farmers legislations relating to farmers, very little research is available in that. Like for example, the correlation between farmer suicide and genetically engineered crops. That connection, even Narendra, what is his name? Pune University's ex-vice chancellor, the economist, wrote a report. Lot of scientists also contributed to that report. They engaged in blaming the victim, saying that farmers who commit suicide have a mental health issue, and the contexts are their lifestyle, their attitude towards death, etc. The systemic issues were not seen from a very broad viewpoint. I mean, that is where law researchers can make a lot of difference. The disparate policies, for example, farmers' issues are governed by Agriculture Ministry. The genetically engineered crops are governed by Agricultural Ministry in conjunction with Environment Ministry clearance and then with the Ministry of Science and Technology. How many ministries? And there is one farmer. But there is no single ministry which as such is putting the farmer in the center. It's a human agent. So I'll be teaching you when we go to law reform research how any law, the Welsh have brought out this criteria, how any law has to be benchmarked against certain criteria. In India, I was on the commission. We didn't have such benchmarking. That benchmarking, or what we call a checklist through which every law has to go through, is very important. And the first set of criteria, the foremost criteria to test the law against is the children and the youth, because they are more vulnerable compared to adults who are used to certain time frame, whereas these are very new and they are not used to these experiences to withstand the onslaught of changes that may be brought in by the new law. Therefore, there is a very clear indicator which is given in the lawmaking process by them. Countries like South Africa, for example, anything that compromises water or environmental conservation, no law reform from that angle. So generically, it is looking at law reform in any ministry from these benchmarks point of view. So these are the true rule of law governed societies in some sense. No society is perfect, but at least they have made an attempt. In India, we don't have such guidelines. For us, sitting in the commission, I was thinking, many times I was wondering, is it law reform, law commission, or law commission to do only work related to judiciary, not related to people, about justice dispensation, it is about certain areas, and then they say those ministries will make the law. If they refer only, we work. So motto, we don't. So I had a very interesting private member concept coming in, and that was on cess to be levied in order to have taxes removed from agricultural equipments, so that the farmers are benefiting out of this cess, and there will be a contingency fund which will serve the farmers. I thought that was a very far-sighted bill. He was a retired judge, therefore he was able, and a prosecutor earlier to that, he was able to correlate different areas of law. But then we just referred the bill. We don't know what the fate of that bill is. So what we see here in India is a very disparate way of treating the legal questions. So those are the areas for law reformer researchers in India, and for you in your research to bring those areas. So we in law research, we look at concepts to ascertain relevance, correctness, its validity or truth, whether the given concept is right. For example, we had this very interesting research coming from your Tata Institute, where the economists challenged the statement of or findings of Dr. Amartya Sen. He wrote this research in England. The research was hailing Kerala for very effective implementation of land reform. This researcher went to the field. He was from Kerala as well. It's an insider view as well, which is very close to authentic view. But still he examined the field and he saw that the entire land which was coming under land reform was minuscule of the land which was arable, which could be cultivable land. Then how come this land missed the land reform? Of course, Kerala had a very conducive condition of tillers as the owners because of the communist regime which had set the stage. Then how come only so much land came under arable land? The reality was that no bill becomes a law overnight. When the bill was under consideration, lot of the landowners converted that land. They planted tapioca. That's how Kerala never had tapioca as a staple diet. And you see by 70s tapioca became the staple diet. Because you had to find an indigenous market. So tapioca was planted, coffee was planted in Wayanad and all these areas. That's why the floods, they say that because they had to level these hills for cultivation. So they did, rubber became, that's also a plantation. Rubber is not agriculture, tapioca is not agriculture, that's a plantation. So agricultural land became transformed into plantation land overnight. So land reform cannot be applied because land reform law begins with the definition of agricultural land. And it applies to agricultural land. If there is no agriculture, where is the tiller? Now whether that definition of land reform being applied to agriculture and the definition of agriculture not taking into consideration the empirical reality, that's where empirical dimension comes in, misfire. So that was not considered in Amartya Sen's study because he did not come to the ground and see. He relied on secondary data, the research which was already reported in literature review or what he used as the data. So challenging, anybody is fallible. It's not that somebody is a Nobel laureate. He may be a Nobel laureate in that particular research that he did where he was bringing the rights approach to human development. But when it came to this dimension of hailing Kerala for success of land reform, he erred, and a young researcher brings out this reality. That is what we mean by ascertaining the validity or truth, correctness or truth. Identify, we have another dimension here. Media being, now if you look at the media reports on 377 and all those big marches which are taken out by the LGBT community, was that necessary? Greeting the judgment, etc. And another thing is that, my college, you cannot even discuss. The youth is very sensitive about this issue because fashion industry, the advertisement, everybody highlights this as if you are into moksha. You have evolved as a human being if you are supporting LGBT. Somebody who supports diversity and human ingenuity will anyway support. There is no need of being so loud and rampaging about it because it's one of the diverse expressions. There are many other diverse expressions like poverty, for example. The way people have evolved amidst the poverty, we don't spend so much energy on that. Something as private as sexuality seems to be taking too much of energy. So critical approaches to truth, to unveil the truth, is what is the idea of researchers' investigation. In that judgment, Indu Malhotra, puts a sentence where she talks about, I think she summarizes the judgment, she talks about not to alter the existing cases in the court. Now, this is a very important part of the judgment. I think it was a very calibrated kind of line there. And also, not to make something felony, something which is natural as a felony. That's a good part of the judgment. That someone's sexual preference is a very private choice. That cannot be made into felony. But on the other hand, if it is circumscribed by, let us say, duress, coercion, cheating, then somebody under the influence of drugs or alcohol, etc., then it will fall in criminality. So it is not wholesale decriminalization. And when you are hailing this decriminalization, you are forgetting that there could also be gender neutral rapes, gender neutral situations. So, before giving out the signal that sexuality as such is a licentious activity and total decriminalization is there, the judgment clearly says that there is no decriminalization of non-consensual same-sex relationship. Because rape, I mean, was that necessary or was that redundant? Now, this is where your technical lawyer reading is very important. Was that necessary after the 2013 amendment to the Criminal Act? No. 2013 amendment also did not make rape gender neutral. Although Law Commission, Jagannath Rao's Law Commission has made a recommendation talking about rape as gender neutral crime. So, till that, this is what Madan Lokur and his team said, Justice Madan Lokur and team said in independent court judgment. Did anyone of you read that?
Yes.
Yes. Harmonious construction of various laws. Harmonious construction of personal law with the criminal law of rape and with the Child Rights Convention of Human Rights Law, Juvenile Justice Act. How many laws? So, that kind of harmonious construction of IPC with the crucial 3 articles, right? 19, 21, 14 was very important. So, those are the technical parts which media people are not able to grasp at all unless you are trained in law deeply. You cannot understand the nuances of the judgment. That's what I was arguing in National Judicial Academy, that we need to train our judges or our judicial spokespersons to release the right kind of content, and our media professionals to be trained to pick up the right content and not to mislead the public, either by disinformation or misinformation. Because then there is exaggerated versions of rights leading to behavioral excesses. Because it's a total mistaken behavior. Sometimes you'll see educated people also making mistake because they don't have the sense of law and justice. So this is where I see that harmonious construction dimension, that itself can become a very good subject of research in different areas of specialization. Now we are talking about nature and composition of legal institution, its efficacy, success or failure. Abhinav Chandrachud wrote 2 articles in Economic and Political Weekly way back in 2010-11 period. One was on maximum chief justices, which regional composition they had, means which state did they hail from, and at that time what was the composition of the Supreme Court, and the judicial, what is that called, the collegium composition and its correlation with the judges who were there. Second article he wrote was about the kind of judgments which came from different high courts. So studying the legal institution, we don't have enough research. People do in the same area, IPR, cyber law, put our judicial institutions under scrutiny. There is a lot of research which is required. When I was in the commission, 4 of us took a journey to 2 different regions in India, just to study what are the best practices to make the judiciary efficient. We were able to cull out about 21 best practices in Delhi High Court, and we tried to apply it in, we tried to see the resonances in other high courts. We found that not even 50% of them were present in Maharashtra or in Karnataka or in other places. On the other hand, best practice of mediation in Karnataka with the handouts and training, etc. was much more organized than in Delhi, although Delhi's Samadhan Center is a very successful one, but the approaches were much better in Karnataka. The judicial impact by the high courts, the way the judges thought, was far superior and progressive in Delhi and in Mumbai. So original jurisdiction high courts seem to be engaging in contributing original principles of law in Madras as well. So some of these we were able to see, but it was not a very structured research. Some of the findings found their way into National Justice Mission. Some of the findings were taken upon by the later Law Commission report, 20th Law Commission report on judicial reforms. So this is how you see that you can compare provisions, principles, institutions of one legal system with that of the other. One of my colleagues did a study on role of prosecution in the French legal system and Indian legal system. Of course, there was a basic distinction. There was a very dynamic role played by prosecution in the French legal system because it is a inquisitorial system compared to our adversarial system. Still, there are some good lessons like training of the prosecutors, the hierarchy, etc. So he was able to give those reform suggestions to Law Commission as well as Maharashtra State. And the poor conviction rates, and Maharashtra is one of the lowest. So his reform proposals made a lot of difference. Identify weakness or flaws on the poorly covered areas as far as law is concerned. So these are our success or failure of legal institutions. Like our Gram Nyayalayas, are they Nyayalayas or Anyayalayas? So there was an analysis of that in Economic and Political Weekly, which uses interdisciplinary approach. Sometimes it's a very strong legal analysis as well, which they put in simple language in short form. So what exactly is legal research? How we define and identify or compare it with other research. What exactly is it? Let me take you to the slide. It summarizes. Asking the question relating to rights. Asking the rights question. So which rights, where? Certain legislations give these rights, certain case laws give these rights, certain guidelines, norms which emerge from bylaws give these rights. Looking at the world with unbiased rights, because for lawyer, logic, anything that does not conform to logical reasoning doesn't exist for a lawyer. Lawyer dismisses it. So, looking at the world with unbiased eyes, as long as it's conforming to reasoning, logically convincing, you agree with it. Find how and why law takes. Why the law is effective, why the law is not effective. That also is legal research. Opening an inquiring mind. Your mind has to be open and inquiring, not concluding, inquiring, questioning. You have to join forces with other scholars. You may. For example, we do a lot of research with master's level and PhD level in terms of working with the doctors, working with the IP professionals, scientific departments, etc. I'll give you two research examples. One is on surrogacy in terms of rights of children. So my student did a lot of doctoral research, but she was also able to visit a few parents and find out about the way in which they were effecting the transition between the surrogate parent and themselves. So in what way there were communication gaps, there were communication kept on, you engage in the life of the child right from the moment the embryo is transplanted into the body of the surrogate, etc. I'm talking about pre-bill context. Similarly, we had a research on attack on doctors, which is very frequent in Maharashtra. So, in what cases, how these attacks were managed, how these attacks came up, and we found that doctors' communication was a problem. Effective mediation by a trained mediator could play a bigger role. Patient expectation and frustration, emotions not being handled. So basically the flaw was with the medical training as well, medical curriculum, hospital administration, and the rates, lack of insurance. Most of the people who fought were rural people who did not have much saving or insurance to take care of their health needs. So there were a large number of issues which were brought to the fore by this empirical research. So basically a legal research has values framework, justice framework and rights framework. So let me ask from the audience, how many of you are pursuing PhD? All of you? How many are done with PhD? Okay, I'll ask a question to the one who is done with PhD. Anybody can tell me, what is your research on?
It's a disposal of constitutional bench in the Supreme Court since 1950.
1950
yes, 2014. The role of the Chief Justice in setting up of the benches, disposal rate.
So thank you. So what are you finding? What was your research question?
Actually, the increase of appellate jurisdiction as well as the entertainment of appeals leads to degrees of setting up of constitution bench as well as disposal of constitution bench. That is my hypothesis.
These are the two variables and it
yes.
was the hypothesis. So was the hypothesis affirmed or was it a null hypothesis?
It's accepted.
It's affirmed.
Yes, the Chief Justice, they concentrated more on the ordinary appeals because they want to show that they are regularly disposing of the appeals. So they are reluctant to set up the 5-judge bench. Even 377, actually it was appeal, 2-judge bench was decided, then reviewed, then curated, then went to constitution bench. After T.S. Thakur, actually more number of constitution bench were constituted. But before you see T.S. Thakur, during the period of Chief Justice Balakrishnan, and from 80s and 90s, there were very less number of constitution benches. As not like.
So is it process centric or judge centric?
Is judge centric, and moreover recently the master of procedure also, I think I can correlate with that one, because they have more powers in setting up of the
So
benches.
which university you submit your thesis to?
In Ambedkar Law University, Chennai.
And was this published in any journal?
Yes, yes, different journals I have.
What have you published?
With regard to appeal cases in Ram Manohar Lohia National Review, then and moreover this issue also, National Court of Appeal also they were discussed. We can make the Supreme Court as a principal bench to deal only with the constitutional matters as well as the public importance, and we can have a NCA in between the High Court and Supreme Court. So those aspects also I have discussed.
Which other country has got this mechanism?
Mechanism is actually, when the matter came before the Supreme Court, Mukul Rohatgi argued in Pakistan they debated with this one but it failed. But whereas K.K. Venugopal was an ardent supporter for this one, and he said in I think Northern Ireland somewhere else, the experimental.
Sri Lanka has this.
And
Good. So now my question is, did you send these recommendations to the Supreme Court?
I didn't.
That is what we do. That is called impact. Impact pathways. So when they come across this research, they may invite you for a discussion, and they may say that they may further clarify. It can make your research also more useful, and it can impact on the delays in the court and better streamlining of the courts.
But when I apply through RTA to seek information with regard to, because when one CJ may refer a matter to the constitution bench, but at once they won't constitute the bench. It may take years, 5 years, 4 years, etc. And another CJ will set up the bench. I asked the duration period, how long will you take this during this particular period, certain cases and all. They didn't respond. It comes under section 8 of RTA, cannot be disclosed. It depends upon the pressure of the CJ. So they won't actually, they are reluctant. They won't.
Yeah, but it's okay. But your research you could have discussed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a good research. So that research is on judicial institution, and it has a bearing on constitution. It has got a bearing on rights of citizens to access to justice and constitutional rights as well. To some degree, what do you think could have enriched the approach to this research? You know something called organizational behavior, organization management. Did you try to cull out any theory or principle from management sciences or OB, organizational behavior? No. Leadership? No. So this is where court management concept is coming in. Nalsar introduced a course on court management, but I don't know how mature it is. Thorough understanding of management principles, organizational structures and governance principles could help. Unfortunately, governance as an idea is into code of ethics, which is again self-regulatory. It is into controls, it is into reporting. Whom does the CJ report? So this is where the limitations are, but a management science could have enriched the landscape rather than governance theories. We have something called institutional theory in sociology. And institutional theory has given reason to organizational behavior along with psychology, and it has also been used to deconstruct or critically evaluate corporate responsibility and corporate governance. So if you could further your research on that and make some recommendations, that would be helpful. Let's go to some other new research. All of you are in the first stage of undergoing the coursework, or is there anyone who has finished the coursework and is on the verge of submission? Nobody. So all are into coursework, I assume. So those who are in coursework, can you tell me about your topic, one of you? From this side, yeah.
The competition law and its collision with the different sector regulators. Competition Commission of India and its collision with the different sector regulators like SEBI, RERA, TRAI.
So are you looking at it from the point of view of one particular business segment or all business?
I'm particularly doing from the collision of the jurisdictions.
Okay.
So like when the anti-competitive agreement or the use of dominant or a combination comes, how the SEBI reacts. There is a provisions of reference, how frequently they refer the cases to each other.
So what is your scope and what is your limitation? See, this is very important in research. He said from 1950 till 2014, and he has taken only certain type of cases. Don't you think quantitative research's rationality comes here? That everything in the data is not taken, but whatever is taken is not taken by arbitrary choice, but there is certain justification. So tell me about it. Are you taking all cases? Are you taking only certain cases? Is there a year time frame within which you are taking? And are you excluding? What is not covered is the limitation.
Like actually, I can't confine it to the timing because competition law comes into existence in 2002 and it operates from 2007 on. Prior to this thing, the SEBI was already into the existence, the TRAI was already existent. Their PML also having the element of the competition law. So I need to appraise how they have acted before the competition law and what the scenario can change after the competition law. So I think right from the institute, I am not certain so far, but right from the incorporation of the SEBI and the TRAI, now the new institution RERA has been come up. So accordingly, I have to check their respective cases, how many cases onto the court.
You are ready to check.
Competition issue, actually they have given
Suppose there are 200 cases, you will cover all 200 or will you limit it? So what is the title of your study?
The title is the collusion of the Competition Commission of India with other sector regulators.
The word collusion, is that the correct word? Think about it. Correlation will be better. Yeah. Collusion means they are together. They need not be because one is afterwards in timing. So automatically a timing will come there from this year to this year kind of. So that will give a more pronounced structured approach to your thesis or your investigation. Very good. So it has a bearing on law. It has other scholar joining, like in case of SEBI, like in case of TRAI. It has got values, justice, rights framework, right? Yeah. Yeah, please.
Question, like my friend said about this, as you described this, you could have sent this recommendation to the Supreme Court. Is there a dividing line where such a recommendation would, lead to contempt?
Not necessarily. Contempt of court is where you lower the image of the judiciary.
But when you are advising the court with certain.
No, he has done a study, he is sharing it, he is not advising. It's for them to take it or leave it. But he will not reach the goal of his research until he connects it to those to whom it has to make an impact. It may also give him certain guidance on his assumptions. They may say that this is not what it is, or this is the reason for it being like this, etc. I think until the dialogue between scholars and systems happens, systems can't improve. India is the only country, or India is one of those backward countries in that sense, where intellectuals are treated as third to politicians and bureaucrats. The day we have expertise, I should use the word expertise, that is an expertise. He has studied it for how many years?
It's almost 4 years.
4 years research. So, has any judge studied that for 4 years? No. No one would have studied as much as he has studied. Therefore, he is an expert in that field. He has gone through everything. Comparative jurisdiction he has seen, data he has collected. He has taken that effort. Now that is your strength as PhD. PhD is not simply a degree. Nowadays everyone wants to register for PhD. I don't blame that. I am in support of that. But PhD is a journey which should lead you to become absolutely independent in your thought process, very thorough with your material, and master of the methodology. If it is not, then it is not worth it. So I am interrogating him, he is able to answer. That means he has conducted the study himself, he didn't copy. He did not take anybody's help. Because he is able to explain everything. He has read it first hand. This is how we do in Viva, in evaluation. I had evaluated one of the theses, excellent thesis from JNU, the student is here, Mr. Upadhyay, on international humanitarian law under Dr. Desai's guidance. See the way you should read, these are all available on Shodhganga, I suppose. Now you have to put all PhD, I'll teach you how to evaluate a thesis also. So that you do the reverse thought process. If my thesis does not conform to this, it will be rejected. So we'll go to that quickly. So is that clear to all of you? Yeah. So now we come to doctrinal and non-doctrinal approach to research. Doctrinal is always looking at purely academic journey based on library-based research. Usually doctrinal themes are evaluated for relevance of efficacy, justice, fairness, protection of rights, liberties. I'll leave the PowerPoint and all the reference materials for you, don't worry. It is a research which provides systematic exposition of rules governing a particular legal category. So legal category, very important. What is that legal category? Pick it very carefully. Don't confuse, don't overlap. Areas of difficulty and predicts future developments. Not mandatory, but it may predict. So sometimes there is a messy work done by judges, by law commission, by jurists, by legislators. It is waiting for scholars like you to pick it up and neatly arrange it and show a pattern, show a relation between them, compare it, show the flaws in that, or show, if not flaw, direction for improvement, for future growth, based on evidence. Research cannot be a research unless you have cited evidences from other works or from facts that you have gleaned either from your secondary research in the library or from empirical validation. So nothing you can write unless there is evidence. So people hate me when I ask, even in the administration or in research, when I ask, so what is the basis on which you are told? Where is the evidence? So where is the evidence is something nobody likes to hear. Therefore, you as a researcher cannot write anything, cannot agree with something unless it is validated by evidence, unless the counter analysis, I mean what is saying, you say that such a phenomenon exists, that judges are using there, it is judge centric. Is there any process there by which judge follows or yardsticks which judge applies while deciding? Then it is not judge centric. There are certain criteria that judge uses. If only you had interviewed those judges and you were able to get those criteria, you would have been able to put that process as guideline in your outcome. I don't think discretion is absolute, then you become Hitler. Discretion is always rooted in rule of law. That's what I feel. If you are in judicial work or legal work, justice work or law work, your discretion is not absolute like anybody else because you are trained in law. You will always, if not rule, you will find a justification based on which you will do that. Therefore, if those criteria were available, you would have been able to draw up a guideline. And by your analysis, if you were able to see certain patterns, you could give those as pointers or guidelines. Yes.
Ma'am, actually, you mentioned about the management perspective, no? I have not, but I analyzed with regard to CJA role in that particular one. And I found that when I interviewed Rajiv Dhawan was the first one to do a quantitative analysis based on Supreme Court dockets. He published a book called Supreme Court is Under Stress.
Yes.
It's 1960s something else. Then George Godboy also some qualitative analysis. I read that particular book, and Nick Robinson also did some certain aspects. And when I interviewed Rajiv Dhawan, he said that because it's a discretionary power, it's a highly prerogative power of the CJI in picking up of the judges in the constitution bench. That was the problem in latest also. And when he mentioned
resource management principle, which talks about competence,
there is no criteria at all, ma'am. Actually, it's a pressure of.
They need training. I tell the Judicial Academy, teach them how to handle human
And
resources.
recently, Hindu, no, actually they made a research that is after 1993, they took certain CJS, and after 1993 only collegium formed. So in these particular constitution benches, how many judges from the collegium they picked and put it in the constitution bench? So they studied and they found that in Deepak Mishra, Justice Deepak Mishra period only actually less number of judges from the collegium, they were acting as the judges in the constitution benches. But I found that also is not rational because
They're journalists. They don't know anything.
only the they want to see the expert in the particular field. Only those people can be picked and put in the constitution, but depends upon the subject matter of the case. So it's not necessary that always the member from the collegium should be part of the constitution bench. That also is management aspect. We have to think about that.
Exactly, exactly.
So, time and again, the CJI is saying that I am the master of the roster without setting out any guideline.
Yeah.
It also certainly it is pure discretion somewhere. They don't want to let the people at large know that what is the criteria on which I am going to settle a particular case.
See, one of the things could be that expertise comes in.
Yes,
Yeah,
that should
that
be.
is what I told. In this country, expertise is the last thing that after disasters we call the experts, not before, not in preventive manner. If you look at defense and all, they are always expertise driven. Why can't we have, in academics also we don't go by expertise. Expertise is the last thing that is called. Who is in power, who is close to the judges, who is this, who is that kind of. It is who, not what they know, not the merit, not the strength. Seldom, I mean in science and technology you couldn't take that risk. Nobody takes such risk in flying planes. There they will have expertise. They won't go by whose relative is who. You give the lives of so many people to such pilots who are related to a politician, it's gone. So they don't do that. In those cases they are smart enough not to do that. But when it comes to affecting the millions of lives, which are, in my opinion, it is a hidden threat to survival. In those cases they play this risk in high places of power. So that is where I think expertise is very important for judges. Administrative expertise, management expertise. Sometimes administrative judges in high courts also, I was told, I was trying to understand this phenomenon and I was suggesting to the commission how court management principle has to come in. Of course, Delhi High Court is doing a wonderful job, very smooth flow. Mostly judges have good work because hierarchy kills all the dissidents. If it was like our enterprise, where in private enterprise anybody can be against you, except unless you have the grace of the top management, where dissidency is possible, and in a very highly evolved political setup, state universities, etc., dissidency is possible. But in highly hierarchical systems like bureaucracy and judiciary, dissidence is very difficult because their confidential reports and survival is dependent on that. That's why they run smoothly. But if first time we saw the dissidents and what happened in Supreme Court, Chief Justice had to change his ways. He finally had to amend his ways. So that wouldn't have come if it was expertise driven. If it was doing a discussion and drawing up the roster by mutual discussion. So where there is democratic approach, then such problems don't come. Anyway, that's a separate expertise by itself. That's why I said organizational behavior dimensions, etc. In your recommendation that should have come. If you had spoken to someone from that expertise area and put certain questions and brought in this without telling it's judiciary, a highly powerful organization has got this.
Madam, if you permit, I can cite two examples.
Yeah.
One is about Justice M.K. Mukherjee, who rose from a position of a renowned criminal lawyer. Most of the cases, criminal cases, were decided by him in Supreme Court. Another example I will cite from Madras High Court about Justice Nagamutu, who rose from now practicing in the Supreme Court. He rose from a defense lawyer, became a High Court in Tamil Nadu, and he brought the pendency of all criminal appeals up to date. So this background of judges is there in the mind of, at times, I don't say all the time.
Very good point. See, this is called, I used this criterion in my report, priority. Prioritizing the cases. Why criminal cases have to be prioritized? They have huge implication for constitutional guarantee. Madhya Pradesh, I was told, in Indore High Court, at that time when we were doing the analysis, bail petitions were waiting for 7 years. Bail petition appeals. What kind of fundamental rights violation is that? So definitely these are person-centric, and that person didn't do it as an individual choice, but did it with the validation of the constitutional guarantees. I mean, you can find some validation. You might have found some, but you mightn't have found some. So where you can't find any validation, then that is the area to be challenged. Yeah.
Ma'am, since you have mentioned that Delhi High Court and more appreciating more about the functioning, everything else, can you say about how the master of procedure function? The CJ have any criteria, or there also how the High Court, that is
CJ has a criterion of expertise.
Okay, is okay.
Some judges didn't have the expertise, but they built the expertise. Till then, they were made to sit with puny judges.
Okay.
Very good human resource administration principle, at least at that time when I was studying. And very good cordiality between judges also. And Delhi High Court judges are a breed by themselves, I'll tell you. It's a very good High Court.
But there is no written rule with regard to picking up of judges. That is allotting the cases to be taken.
Discretion, power, as you said.
Okay.
Power. The power, absolute power means more accountability at choice. Absolute power means you give such absolute power with the faith and assumption that this person is so competent that you are willing to give that power. If that person exhibits such whims and fancies, that means your choice is wrong and time has come for reconsideration. That's what Justice Muralidhar says in one of his articles. Why judicial accountability is not written? Because with highest power comes highest responsibility. You are supposed to self-regulate. You are supposed to question yourself. You are your own regulator. That is a kind of contemplative maturity which is expected in the highest power position. If that is not there, that means your system now has to rethink on such power connotations. That's what it means. Yeah. Let's go. So these are all the kinds of different definitions. But for us in legal research as Christopher Langdell, have you heard this name, anyone? Christopher Langdell is the person who introduced the IRAC, the case method of Harvard, more than a century ago, which has become the best practice in law teaching. One of the tools of law teaching and one of the tools of law learning in Commonwealth legal systems where cases form the essence of law. He talks about being the systematic and ordered exposition of legal doctrine in commentators, etc. It has to be looking at the case. I have a separate module on case analysis, but for your benefit I can tell briefly. When you look at a case reported, divide the case into 4 parts. One is the issues which come, which are the facts of the case, I. Second is that precise rule. Elaborate that rule. Rule may be section, let us say, section 7 of Hindu Marriage Act or something like that. So that rule. And then the analysis of the rule and analysis of the issues in face to face, which is done either by the argument of the lawyers on both sides or judge's exposition as well. And then conclusion. So IRAC has got these 4 parts. Conclusion is, what is the judgment? Is it in favor of the appellant or the respondent? Why in their favor? Which is that crucial fact? Ratio decidendi fact. So the judgment in whose favor it is gone is the holding of the judgment. What caused that holding is the reason for the decision, the ratio. Any other observation made by the way of generic nature is the arbitrarita. So that conclusion that the judge draws provides you enough material for even finding hypothesis for the evolution of law after that precedent is set. So we usually teach this IRAC method by giving case laws to students and making them go through that case law and then do the anatomy, divide it into parts of issues, rules, analysis and conclusion. Have you done it any time, any of you? Yeah. How many of you have done? You have done, yeah. Yeah, please.
While mooting, when you're drafting a memorial, we generally tend to use the IRAC method, and when you're arguing, we tend to use the CRAC method.
Yeah.
Because that is easier for someone to listen and just understand.
So what is the C there? Tell for the benefit of
C is conclusion, rule, analysis, conclusion.
Okay.
So I start with arguing that this is the best room in the university. The rule being that a room with the most wood is the best rule. Analysis, 80% is wood. Conclusion, therefore this is the best rule.
Yeah.
The best rule.
So rationalizing at every level and limiting the rationality to the given set of facts depending on the case when you are arguing, but entire case as such when you are presenting in an academic analysis for research or for the purpose of presenting in the class. That is where all issues are taken. In mooting, they split the issues and they take. So that is where it becomes a subset of IRAC analysis, as he said, CRAC analysis. So I hope all of you know about it. In the afternoon, they are going to deal with it. So Langdell was the one who said for us, library is the lab. That is Langdell, black letter law. But beyond Langdell, in last two centuries, law's march wouldn't have happened if it was going beyond the lab of library. For us now, the court is a lab, community is a lab, the college is the lab. For us, the lab goes beyond library alone. That is where the difference between doctrinal and social legal or non-doctrinal research comes in, the empirical research. So here we look at identifying the nature of the principle, and in one we look at explanation, rationale and argument. We look at evaluating information on a systematic basis. So we draw it from the library-based resources. So we identify the nature and governing principles. Sometimes we take a theory and we try to apply. For example, what we did one article on tradition and modernity in terms of gender-related cases in Supreme Court. Is there a polarity in the judicial discourse? So we saw that the polarity within the realities of gendered cases, like for example Sabarimala case we wrote it in 2015. We took the Awak case, so different religions related to gender rights, and we showed how Supreme Court always, High Courts and Supreme Courts have always been the mouthpiece of modernity. They had to veer between tradition and modernity, but they have always chosen to stand by modernity, and thereby the social changes are ushered in. They have done it sometimes without altering the tradition's framework drastically. In some cases, they altered the framework drastically, and they even lamented the framework. So we picked a handful of cases in the Hindu practices. One was the Shiromani case of Delhi on Baris system, where the two families had altering puja rites between the descendants, male descendants. And in that generation, the particular family did not have a male descendant, it was a female descendant. So they went to the court saying that she is not entitled to puja rights because of the physical change that she undergoes every month, and that can pollute the temple. And therefore the puja rights should dwell back in the family which has a male descendant. Justice Ravindra Bhatt, reflecting on the case, said that this argument itself runs contrary to equality clauses in the constitution. Any kind of physical change conflicting with the tradition, she can have her attorney, and that attorney could be from the first family or a third party. But for those 5 or 7 days only she delegates it. That does not alter her inherent rights. Wonderful judgment, where they have questioned the tradition without altering the stability and asserted the constitutional equality. The other judgment comes from Madurai bench of Chennai, the Pinnacle case, where the lady was deprived of the management of the temple, of the Amman temple. So the judge laments, there was a mediation attempted by the Tahsildar and everybody, but the traditionalists were against this woman continuing the puja rites, because in that family also no male member, only female heir. Then the judge gives a judgment saying that it is most lamentable that for a female goddess, a female doesn't get access to get closer. So the way the judgments have come, how they have been striking at the roots of the tradition, and tradition modernity polarity is being balanced by the judges, and their whole journey which they go through is also veering between this polarity to make the pendulum swing in the right direction by taking refuge in constitutional guarantees and human rights. So we have shown it by about 21 cases we have used belonging to different religions. So here we used a doctrine from social cultural analysis, applied it to a particular category of gender. You can apply it to the case of exclusion by caste, exclusion by religion, denial, exclusion. The discrimination as such is such denial, exclusion, bias. So how courts have handled this? So number of articles can come looking at this, or researchers can come. So I am showing doctrinal research. Social legal research is we create a hypothesis as he created, and then making it more scientific by using social science approaches, by proper sampling, proper data collection tools, testing of the hypothesis, and affirming or null hypothesis. It may achieve the status of original research because it is bringing the empirical reality and thereby creating a new theory or enlarging the theory or disproving the theory, because hypothesis is a generalization which is at a hypo theory, and then it becomes a theory. Then you go meta theory. So this is how the evolution of knowledge happens, by using empirical reality. Is that okay? Yeah, so this is the difference. You will be studying, this focus of this workshop is more on doctrinal research. Therefore, when you do the case analysis, you locate the law and analyze the text. I gave you the case of what we call the tradition and modernity polarity. You can read that in American Journal. Martha Benu, the dean of Harvard Law School, talked about doctrinal restatement as doctrinal research, critical projects as doctrinal research, proposition testing, policy analysis. I have a study for you from Vidhi Partners, who are a completely dedicated policy and law research think tank situated in Delhi, whose work has been cited. R.K. Sengupta's work has been cited by Supreme Court. They talk about 25 topics for legal reform in India. I will be leaving it for you. In that, they set the context in the context of sustainable development, in the context of energy, in the context of environment, in the context of social justice. So these examples will show you how doctrinal research can be involved in policy research and how did they develop the argument. Then we have comparative inquiries. I gave you the example. Historical inquiries. Historical inquiry, especially in Shabarimala case, was assuming a lot of importance. Jurisprudence and philosophy of law. Combination of all these approaches. Like happiness, for example, right to happiness, I was telling you. I was telling Dr. Bajpayee, he did not know about it. There is a film by Bruce Willis, I think, on Pursuit of Happiness. Anyone of you has watched that film? Sorry. Yeah. So this film, how it captures the reality, and if you were a doctrinal legal researcher, you would do it in the concept of thematic analysis of the film and such films, and how the trajectory has been capturing. If you were to do empirical study, you will show the film to a particular group and assess their opinion. If you were to do it as an educative tool, you will use that film and connect it to the constitutional guarantee of happiness and right to life, anti-discrimination, and systemic limitations or inequality. So there are multiple things, activities through which you can analyze the film and you can publish a research on that. If you were to team up with the media researcher, you would have quantitative analysis, you would have qualitative analysis of audience studies, content analysis studies, audience analysis. So there are multiple ways by which same material can be used aside from the legal cases. Now Arthur published a very important report in the Canadian context, and according to him, deeper understanding of law as a social phenomenon, research on the historical, philosophical, linguistic, economic, social or political implications of law is also doctrinal analysis. For example, I was doing a module on corporate law and social justice in Ramaya College, and I was talking about operations of the corporates and social justice. Social justice within the working of the constitution. For example, if I am establishing my corporation in a particular area, which is developed, which is an area where the land has been acquired and many people have been rendered homeless or landless, how many employments I give? That is economic justice within social justice. If I go to a rural community and I try to publicize, I try to gather their traditional knowledge, making them equitable partners in the fruits of that knowledge when I corporatize it. If I am able to find indigenous knowledge and if I am able to market it in a big way for wealth creation, so it is social justice beyond pure social justice in terms of socio-economic justice. Today also, less than 1% Dalit entrepreneurs. That speaks a lot about how social justice can be a big block to economic justice. We don't seem to see this. We seem to see them in silos. So I was arguing how operation of the corporations themselves can be a solution to problems of social and economic injustice. I don't know if that kind of broader view can be taken in our context, but it's a long way to go, but that is something that is required. In Australia, reform-oriented research, theoretical research and doctrinal research are connected. Similarly, legal reasoning is taken as the core. And most of the time, the discussion can come from a theory. That theory, as I told you, institution theory can be applied in corporate law context. Theory can come from pure justice theory. Theory can come about the nature of the law and different theories of law being applied. Theory can come from, theory can be suffused with approaches, qualitative and quantitative. We had used triangulation approach when we were, what is triangulation? Triangulation is a term which comes in survey. When you are, if this is the point, and how far that point is from the water resource, from the sea, from the highway, triangulation. One point, the distance of which is measured to 3 other points, and thereby being able to talk about that point's phenomenon as a habitable or operable area. Similarly, in research, we were doing a research on sex workers of Karnataka, about policy reforms related to female sex workers. So we use the triangulation method in order to see how existing policy, is there any policy first of all? Secondly, how existing policy is working. How is their condition of exploitation, socio-economic and other, what is the condition of their children? So what we did was, we did statistical data, collecting socio-economic and other information from the rights point of view, from the entitlement point of view. Then secondly, we collected case studies which gave us more information, and then we did a focus group discussion with their organizational members to find out the policy priority. Our commonsensical idea was that what they need is a house. If they have a house, then social ostracization could be limited. Then we thought alternative employment. Third, we thought is some kind of allowance by which they are able to lead a life of dignity. Now what we found in reality was their priority was not house, their priority was a job, was a skill. They said that once I have another identity, I am able to live with dignity, and then somebody will give me the house, I will not have any problem. So we rolled out the policy, we got more than 900 crores granted from the government. But to get to that point, our study had to be so convincing, its data had to be so correlating. So district-wise data we took, we conducted meetings of the officials. So 30 districts, out of 30 districts we culled out the material. So this kind of research is triangulation research, where doctrinal research helps us in finding categories and drawing up that tool of questionnaire. Doctrinal research helps us to what to look for in the case analysis, and then the doctrinal research helped us what to be priority of the policy. It is the literature review based on which we proceeded. So mainly doctrinal research these days is more on interdisciplinary angle in legal research. It's undertaken because there are certain standards in the discipline, in the legal discipline also. It gives us a high level critique as well. It needs guiding principle or pseudo hypothesis. I'll give you some example. One is the dialectics research, dialectics theory, which in my personal research I developed, how intellectual property in life, biodiversity, is a contention. There's a contention between conservation and technology, which is the corporatization of life. You get a gene, for example, in nature, and then you get it into research lab, and then you develop a patent for that, and you develop another genome out of it, transgenic organism, and then you induct it as a kind of product, and you make profit as a company based on the patent. So I showed how there is a dialectic, constant tension between life and patents. So how do you resolve this tension? That's where equity, benefit sharing, access, all these dimensions came, traditional knowledge, etc. First of all, not to be too protective about patenting. and the patenting has to be passing through the acid test of ethics, environmental ethics, etc. Second is the polarity research which I shared with you. Third is showing US hegemony in the Competition Act across countries. The evolution of the very competition law across the world and showing how US law has been simply recast and given to different countries in the world and how it is impacting those countries in its operation. The very important study was made by Jawaharlal Nehru University's one researcher, wonderful research. So there are many researchers like this. In stem cell research, for example, how regulation is conforming to bioethics or not. Third gender related research, we were looking at right to health of the third gender, especially when they go for surgeries, how they operate in secrecy because of the social stigma, how hospitals and personnel are not informed about this, how there is no investment in research on such surgical tools, and how these people suffer due to post-operative care not being taken. So there was a research by one of my students from Calcutta. Then fragmentation to integration in terms of international law, any related area you can take, whether it is gender rights, children's rights, how there is a fragmented treatment, how there is a need for integration. For example, social security, healthcare justice, the very concept of healthcare justice, how it is operating in case of marginalized. The disabled, we wrote an article in EPW, myself and my researcher, on disembarkation of a passenger, offloading of a passenger from a SpiceJet plane who was disabled, Jija Ghosh case. I don't know anybody has read that case. So we were talking about how in that case awarding of the compensation ushered in a new era, that the treatment meted out to the specially abled people is not a charity of anybody, but it is the basic right to be compensated for not being equal. Then cyber crime related research about cyber technology and how it makes it difficult to track the crime. What kind of new technology and protocol should be introduced? So that's about it. So we proceeded on these good topics based on existing literature, and that literature we set in a context, and then based on we set the literature also from basic concept in introduction, then in the main body, large picture to narrow picture, we call it inverse pyramid. Then we concluded by saying what are the inadequacies in the literature, what are the areas which have not been studied, where are the conflicts, what are the variations which have come after this literature, and we do a small section of gap analysis, and then we embark on the new topic which we justify based on the current knowledge and based on the lack of knowledge in the previous research. So a good literature review based on doctrinal concepts that we have picked up should be answering these questions. Is there a sound rationale for taking up this topic after this literature review? Is the aim stated? Is the hypothesis being tested? Are research questions forming into chapter investigations? Is the method appropriate? Is there any bias of the method? Is the method chosen with lot of consideration, ruling out? So you have to show a discussion. You chose this method. You didn't choose the other method because. So both should be coming. What efforts to make the data valid and reliable, trustworthy? Is your sample appropriate? Even if you are choosing only one judge of the Supreme Court for study in doctrinal study, Krishna Iyer's judgments on labor law. Why Krishna Iyer? Why not any other judge? Why? Krishna Iyer was a trade unionist, he was a politician, he was the only judge who was also a minister. If anybody has studied Krishna Iyer's life history. To his own ideological underpinnings. So you can justify why you have taken. Unless you justify, why not Bhagavati? Why not someone else on labor law? So always justify your universe and sample. Are the results warranted by the analysis that you are undertaken, or are the results supported by the study? Are there any ethical dilemmas? For example, when I did the sex worker study, we were not supposed to retain the data, because you retain that data, it falls into police hands, because they said so many dirty stories about the way the police abused their power with them. There was a danger of them being targeted. So we converted the respondents' names into codes, and there were photos and interviews, etc. We burnt them, and we had evidence of burning them also kept intact. According to NACO guidelines, according to ICMR guidelines, we had to treat the data of human subjects in certain way. Does your university have an ethical guideline? National Hospital Delhi? Is there a research ethics statement? How many universities have research ethics committee? Even if you are doing legal research ethics committee is a must. Research ethics policy is a must. You don't do it, you are not according to human rights. Because I remember once I had sent my students to collect some data in Media Studies Institute as well. And the tribal leader came and told me, your students come, we give the data, what is the benefit for us? What is the guarantee they don't sensationalize our stories? So we gave an undertaking. We also generated some funds and supported their cause. There is always a give and take policy which has to be justified. And not to objectify your data, not to use them according to your whims and fancies. So once you do the literature review and you see that the literature review is comprehensive, up to date, good quality literature like American Journal of American Business Review or something, Harvard Journal, highly cited, highly indexed, most recent articles being there. At least to make it look good, you see that this good quality literature is figuring there. And you can look at some sample reviews once again from the Shodh Ganga. There are very good researchers there. How do you plan to improve? What are the improvements? I mean, this is what, if we had more time as a workshop, I will take 2-hour session on only literature review and make you do the, make you share the reviews and analyze the review and say, is it a good review, how to improve. Everybody, each one of you is capable of giving a very good review. So once you have formulated the problem based on the literature review, you are working out a design, you are pilot testing, and then design has got some parts, then you write a report, then there are citations and references. Then you go to the sample of your research. So based on all this idea, first step after literature review that you do is validate the problem that you have spotted. So how do you spot the problem in the first place? You choose a topic which is current, which is relevant, which is interesting you. If it doesn't interest, even if it's the best of the topics, you won't proceed. It's the last thing you'll do. You'll go watch a movie, hang out somewhere, but you won't get back to your books. So always choose something that keeps your interest going. So I had a student from Assam who was not happy with the way the Muga silk was being marketed. She was feeling very bad about the weavers who were getting peanuts of money, whereas companies were making huge profits. A German lady came and said, I paid 50,000 for this sari in some market, whereas the village rural weaver got not more than 2,500. So she felt it is unjust. Therefore, she embarked on a study. And forever she was interested in getting the data, talking to the officials, going to the field, because it was a matter of interest. She had her heart there. So always pick the topic. Somebody did a research on mercy killing or euthanasia because his dad was in the hospices, cancer hospital. So he was vexed with that question, to let live or to say no. So such people do more and more investigation, they are more interested. So always pick an area which you have deeply felt about, you have interest in that, and then look, read and synthesize. Don't simply conclude on that unless there is some literature. So first when you put the outline of the topic, abstractly say, you always take at least 3 good citations, recent, valid citation, means some great researchers should have worked in that area which will sustain your topic, and then you seek feedback from the expert faculty, expert friends, expert jurists outside. Only if everybody feels it is research worthy, you proceed. Otherwise, once again look for the topic. And once you look for the topic, you undergo what I told, the literature review, thorough literature review, and you fix the parameters of your analysis. So you have to say what is the topic and something which is wrong, which needs a solution. So in our law area, we always pick those as problems where there is inadequacy of law. There is a law, but it is inadequate because something has happened recently. Something like with globalization, like with the opening up of the markets, like with foreign goods and foreigners coming here. Lot of things change. Second could be something which is not there at all. So absence of law. Wherever there is absence of law, wherever there is inadequacy of law, pick that topic, and then impact of that problem, where and when is the problem evident, all these things should be there. So when you are picking a problem, always verify if it makes contribution to the body of the knowledge. Will it make a difference? If you do this study, for example, prosecutor study, it will make a difference for prosecution and successful conviction of the hardcore offenders. Definition of new problem and other research means it leaves a big area for future research as well. That's why our researchers begin with the literature review. They end with scope for further research. They have to identify those gaps. Is it really researchable? Is there enough knowledge, experience, good data, and completable within the allotted time frame? So I tell them, you limit it to Pune, you limit it to 20 cases, you limit it to this time frame, because you may want to do the whole world, but you have to finish it in 3 years. Complete enough for your first study. Is it good enough, simple enough, complete enough? So examine theories, look at the nature, look at the themes. So this is all I can say in the first one. Then you go to the design. I think later on you will study, but in qualitative research usually design is the decision about what you want to study, what is the purpose, what is the scope, what is the type of data required, where can you find the data, what will be the possible area or theme of the study, constitutional law, business law, combination of the two, which periods, what time, how much time is required. So these are the decisions. How much of material, what basis will be used for selection of what techniques of data gathering. This we are talking in empirical study. In qualitative study also, judgments of which type and why. I will show you just quickly. Case analysis. Case analysis we discussed. Let me go to content analysis. I want to take up 20 or 12 cases based on certain theme. Like we did a study on cross-border child removal, which I used in my presentation. I didn't do first-hand study. I came upon an American study because in India, cross-border child removal doesn't come because we are not party to the Hague Convention. But India can be involved because a lot of Indians bring their children from there to here and they get entangled in the case. India is not party to the convention, so the parent comes to India and questions it in the court of law. So how have the high courts decided? What are the factors which are determining which religion, because in India personal law gives different kind of custody rights to different kinds of parents. So we came upon an empirical content analysis study from the US. There the researcher had analyzed about 40 cases and he restricted only to 12 to 20 cases. Why from 40 to 20? One is that some of the cases had repeated similar set of facts. So he eliminated those cases. He retained only those cases where the person had exited that country with the child because there was an imminent threat to life. Imminent threat to life validates, but imminent threat to life based on what? In these cases, the threat to life came from the violent spouse. Threat to life from violent spouse was not considered as a ground in European context because they said you can go to counselors, you can live in separate houses. Why abduct the child? Because the child has the right to have both the parents. So child right considerations to what extent played a key role. So this is how these cases show that cross-border child removal cases did not emphasize or pay attention to the reality of women who were suffering under domestic violence. Mother's right vis-a-vis child's right to have access to the other parent. The damage to the child, if the child had access to that other parent who was violent, was never taken into consideration. Institutionalization of the children was recommended. So in order to avoid all this and fearing all this, Indian women tend to flee the jurisdiction, come back to India and settle. So this is what Indian cases show, but in that case they had multiple jurisdiction cases, Hungarian, Guatemalan and all these cases. So I am just giving you the broad idea. Suppose you were to pick such content analysis in your topic of research, how will you do from the judgments? What categories you will create? The categories were created based on the section, that rule, which had given grounds permitting, grounds prohibiting. So wherever removal was done, was it coming within the prohibited ground or permitted ground? How has the judicial officer or judge interpreted this? Formed the body of the analysis. So you have to first list the cases, you have to justify how many cases, that table was there in this year, this many, in this year, this many, in this year, this many. And then you say only so many cases were retained, and then again you present a table. In that case, what was the basis, what was the contention, what was the outcome. And then you do your analysis and you should. And then you suggest law reform. How should they approach it? In the introduction you say what methodology you have chosen, what theory you have chosen, or what framework of analysis. The framework of analysis is based on that section, why that section has got those grounds. And judgments were picked up from this year to this year. And only these judgments have been retained because some were repetitive and some were irrelevant. So scope and limitation, you got it? So this is one article. The other research that I saw was from Holland about parenting veering between separated couple. Custody versus access, those students of family law. So in this case, how the access was given, how the access was denied. Whenever access was given, the fact of good family life, the criterion is welfare of the child, well-being of the child, good upbringing of the child. There would have been cases where gay lesbian couple would have been involved, means couple who are separated, one of them would have gone for same-sex union, maybe marriage, maybe live-in. So, in those cases, how the courts have interpreted the well-being of the child in such a way that there is recreation and co-creation of families. Same couple, separate, they recreate a family identity for the child, and then they come back and share the parenting with the former spouse in co-creating the family. So both the families' interaction, how it is. This study has been done by a lawyer and a sociologist. So sociologists are able to give the criteria of family and the definition of the family. So because of this, because of the new formation and new possibilities of families, I had seen a family in the UK where the couple initially were friends and then they didn't get married, and then both of them went same-sex way. After that, they both wanted to have a child, but they wanted to have a child where the spouses would be donating the gametes. And the child would be brought up between two families, 4 parents in case of one child. So how do they do that? It is not simply whimsical, conjectural song or something. They lay down the agreement, parenting agreement and family connection. So this is how the whole idea of legal bond, vinculum juris, is created. So analyzing these, the content of such agreements. For example, one of my friends in Ireland did a study on separation of couple, because in Ireland divorce was not allowed. So separated couple, how do they see their family distribution? How do they enable their economic well-being beyond separation? So he was a barrister by qualification as well. So for his doctoral thesis, he did this analysis. Because of being a barrister, he had hundreds of cases which he could bring in as case studies. So I am moving to the next level, where you cannot disclose actual decided cases and you have these situations in front of you. You can use them as case studies, where analysis of case studies are done at the level of first discussing the subjects, their narration, and in that narration taking out the experience, taking out the meaning, symbols, and you begin the case analysis with a theory, and then you do the case study, and then you pick the universals from the case. You may do 4 studies, 4 companies or 4 respondents to Looney Tune cartoon and showing how the copyright dimension is protected or how the copyright dimension is in danger. So these are finally culminating into your conclusions, and that conclusion can be validating, disputing or amending a theory or a law. So I used it in case of gender advocacy about how one NGO was dealing with the cases which was coming in front of it, case studies, and how their narration of injustice, remedy was specifically taken and the NGO was giving this remedy. Simultaneously building them as human, focusing on their human development through monthly meetings and through what we call as critical consciousness raising sessions by films and other means. We had the idea of therapeutic jurisprudence. Therapeutic jurisprudence is that jurisprudence which talks about healing through law, healing approach of the law for the